Today's La Grande Pregunta is French football overlooked? And it's not, as we've done in last week's, overrated or underrated, but overlooked in a sense that the way we view it, it seems to be, and this is where we'll start here, that Sophie, Ligue 1 is not seen with the same respect as the Premier League or La Liga or maybe even Bundesliga and Serie A, and that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of. I guess I'll start up from the top. Do you take issue with the question, or do you find that it might be that people are overlooking it maybe in certain markets or maybe not at all?
I think it is overlooked, but honestly, I think it's pretty normal. I will say that it is the weaker league out of the 5 big European leagues, so I understand that it's not necessarily the league that we talk the most about. I think in certain area we still talk about it a fair bit. I think we talk about it when we talk about the young talents that the league has, because obviously it's one of the best league into producing talents. But yeah, I think we don't really talk about the league as something that exists. Like, we don't talk about the competition, which, fair enough, there is not really a competition right now. So I guess I understand, and I think most French medias will understand why we don't talk as much about French football as we talk about other leagues. Obviously, certain leagues have the same problem. Like, for example, the Bundesliga or the Serie A are dominated by one side, mostly. But I feel like PSG doesn't really have the same status as Juventus or Bayern. And so maybe that's why we don't really see Ligue 1 as a real league, or an interesting and worth following league in terms of competition.
Yeah, that point you bring up about PSG, that kind of leads me to my next question about is French football success measured by the success of PSG? And that does get you thinking about the fact that Bayern Munich and Juventus have gone farther and in the past have won the Champions League, while PSG have yet to get over that hump. And there is something to be said about the amount of time that PSG, and for the reasons for which they became a major club football power.
Yeah, I think the problem is that PSG is a fairly recent club. I mean, it has existed for now a long time, but and they won a European Cup in the 90s, but obviously it became this huge club when the Qataris arrived. So it's fairly recent, and you cannot really compare in terms of status a new club, like a fairly new, rich club, to a club like Juventus or Bayern. And obviously, even though they have money, like you said, they haven't been very far in Europe. They still haven't reached the semifinals, which is crazy when you think about all the money that they spent. So people don't really care, which I understand, because you have this huge club that has lots of money, but doesn't really have, I guess, the results to back this politic, and also doesn't really have, I don't want to say an authenticity, because that I'm not sure it means anything anymore in modern football, but when you pick Juventus, you know what they stand for, or like Bayern, you know what they stand for, and PSG is just this club that has lots of stars that are not even French for the most part, so they don't really have, people don't know what they are, I guess. So until they're not winning that big title, I'm not sure people are going to be very interested in them. You don't have that culture, I guess.
Yeah, they were created in 1970, and again, their history, the history that the global football knows about is even more recent. And the good point about PSG is that it doesn't seem as if they are producing. I mean, this is the whole issue about Adrien Rabiot, and we don't need to really get into him. Particularly, we talked about him on the show in the past when he was linked to Barcelona. But other than him, even Kylian Mbappe is not, we'll say, one of their own. He was developed by Monaco. And I think while PSG is not exporting a ton of young talent to other clubs, that's what Ligue 1, in kind of a similar way that the Bundesliga did. They're producing tons of top-level talents, though, that are succeeding now. And particularly, I think of young center backs going to the Bundesliga, to Cologne or to West Ham. There's a ton of young center backs going other places, and wingers, et cetera, all over Europe from Ligue 1. And I think that ties into the fact that there is a tremendous amount of young talent coming out of France. I'd say even quicker than what's coming out of Spain and La Liga.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is the big assets of La Liga, and actually you can see that now they're building their marketing around it, around the fact that we have all these young talents. The big problem, I guess, is that Liga has a very hard time keeping those talents. So it's
Yeah.
great because we export French football and people see what we're capable of, which is great. Like especially, like you say, like for example in Germany, like lots of teams have French players right now, like Borussia Mönchengladbach and RB Leipzig. They have French players, and especially like you say in the defensive area, or like players who leave very young, like Samuel Mtiti did. But those players, they don't stay for a very long time in France, so it's great for, I guess, them. But it's not very good for La Ligue 1 because every year you have new faces. So it's very difficult for people to get attached to teams and to players because you don't really see them. So for 6 months, you're like, oh, I love Rennes because Ousmane Dembélé is so good. And then he goes away. So it's like very difficult to build, I guess, a fan culture, like
Yeah.
especially abroad, because in France people love their club despite the fact that those guys are going. But like I guess for foreign, like people from different country who might like Ligue 1, it's quite difficult because you don't really know which team has which player from one year to another. So it's except PSG, obviously, because they just have stars. But it's quite difficult. Even a team like Monaco who won La Ligue 1, they sold Kylian Mbappé the next summer.
Right.
Like he didn't even stay a year after they won, and they sold him to PSG, which is so. I guess it's good, and it's a testament of how good the system, the educational system works, and how we're able to produce so many talents. It's good for the French national team more than it's good for Ligue 1, I guess.
Yeah, that's a good point. That even within league, that if you're a team like Lyon or Marseille or Monaco, you're snatching up the other talent from teams, smaller teams, even
Yeah.
with Strasbourg this year being ninth in the table, even Lille being second at the moment. You'd expect that a bunch of their talents are either going to be sold internationally or throughout Europe, or they're going to be even picked up by the larger French teams that might not even be PSG, just Lyon and that. And you did bring up the World Cup as well, and I think that's a good point that the French national team that won that World Cup, most of those players, and particularly the biggest of those stars, do not play in France, and that almost
Yeah.
counts against Ligue 1 in the way that we can say, oh, France have these, and you saw all those graphics as well about France could have fielded what 3 or 4 different starting 11s that were good enough to compete at the World Cup, but yet the majority of those players, even and if you go 40 deep, don't play in Ligue 1, and so that's kind of the question mark there. And on the other side of things, though, it seems like France is a place where, on the women's side of things, players want to play. That Lyon, we've seen, has dominated the women's side of late. So it's almost there is a contradiction there between the men's side of things, where everyone goes abroad and wins the World Cup, and then the women's side of things, where while the
Yeah.
French women's national team is pretty good, Lyon has been the big
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, yeah, Lyon is the best side in Europe, has been for many years now, won the Champions League 4 times, I think, in the last couple of years. So I think the main difference is that for women's football is so the difference between the top teams in Europe and the, I guess, second tier teams is so huge. And French football, and especially Lyon and PSG, have so much money compared to other women's side outside of Germany, because Germany has a good structure also, that of course you have all those women who are coming to those good side. I think the difference for the men is that Ligue 1 has less money than other leagues in Europe. So I guess it's a bit weird, but yeah, women's football is working better right now. Even though the French national team doesn't work that much. So yeah, it's like it's completely opposite. Is that we have a very good men's national team, but a weak league, and we have a weak women's side, but like a very good league. So it's like, it's a bit, yeah, it's completely opposite, which is quite weird actually. Yeah.
Well, this is a Barcelona podcast, so I would be remiss if I didn't speak a little bit about FC Barcelona and their French connection before we wrap up Le Grand Pagunta.
Mm.
Just listing some of Barcelona's French footballers, just of the current generation. There is a previous episode of the Barcelona podcast that was made, I believe, in July. It was over the summer. You can check back in the archives. We talk about Eric Abidal, Thierry Henry, going all the way back. Every player that's ever played for Barcelona that's come from France. But the current contingent was Mane Dembele, who was formed at a combination of a youth club in Évreux, and then Rennes was where he made his breakout. Then he goes to Dortmund, so we think of him coming from Dortmund. Umtiti was Lyon, Clement Lenglet was Nancy, and then was formed in Sevilla. And I think people don't realize that he came from Nancy before that. And Jean-Claire Todibo, a young player, was both Toulouse, but he wasn't even at Toulouse very long. It was a much, much smaller club, Le Lila 93. And then on the women's side of things, at the Femini, Chiara Hamraoui she was all over the place, as we said. The power of French football, Saint Etienne, PSG, and Lyon is where she made her work for the majority of her career. But for that Barcelona French contingent, what do you think each of those, and if you want, you can even go down the list, what do you think each of those gained from their time in French football, and how did it form them as players?
I guess one of the big things that we're talking about a lot in France right now, and especially about players like Ousmane Dembélé, is how good French football is for players who are very instinctive. Players who are like we call them street football players, but I think it's a bit too much because Ousmane Dembélé has been playing football club for years. Like, he didn't play in the streets that much, but he has still that, I guess, very instinctive football, and it's very surprising, and it's very different from how now in Europe every football player, especially winger, all look the same. They all play the same. It's a criticism that is mounting, for example, in Germany, where they think that every winger is the same, and I think like in France we let them be free, which is great for a player that Dembélé. We can be very surprising and make some very bold choices when he's on the pitch. Obviously that makes him maybe a little bit difficult to handle, I've heard. But I guess for attacking players, that's the main thing. And I guess for defensive player, it's a bit the opposite, but it's like we have in France a very, like, especially for the last 20 years, a big defensive culture, because we won the World Cup 1998 with like a very defensive side. So all those guys like Samuel Umtiti, they grew up like having a very strong, I guess, defensive mind, and they're also like very good football players. And I think they, like all our defenders, are built to be very strong physically, but also they know how to handle the ball. And I think that's why Umtiti chose Barcelona, because I think he wanted to be in a club where he could be a strong defender, but also be a defender that plays football. Like, because obviously in Barcelona you have to be a very skilled football player at every step. And I think he kept, even now that he's in a team that has the ball more than Lyon used to have, but he kept this very, I think, strong defensive mindset, and to be very concentrated. And because we have I think we're mostly a defensive league, and even like people complained during the World Cup that we were a too defensive side, for example. So I guess, it's like two different. We formed player in a very different way if they're attacking players or like defensive players.